I'm Pam Jenkins. I'm a research professor of sociology. I've lived in New Orleans for 26 years. The kind of work I do, I'm a community sociologist in that I think about how communities are sustainable, and I do a lot of strategic planning with nonprofits. That's what I did before the storm. After the storm, I have done a lot of what makes recovery, what is response, how do nonprofits operate after a storm, how do communities come back. So like 80% of the city, I flooded. We got 3 feet of water in our house, and because of Rita that came afterwards, the water stayed for about 3 weeks. So when we finally got in, which was about 3.5 weeks after Katrina, there was mold up to the roof. How I've talked about this is the first year when I gave talks about Katrina, I would say, I lost everything, but I was lucky. After that, I would reframe it and say, I was lucky, but I lost everything. And now what I say, with hindsight, is to say, I stand in privilege in this disaster. I had a job that kept paying me. My husband had a job. I had friends. I had all kinds of insurance. So I rebounded after the storm. Not to say there was not a personal and emotional cost to the recovery, but that things happened to me in not the same way that happened to others. So for example, if I called FEMA and someone said, no, I won't pay for your rent for your apartment, I would wait 2 or 3 hours and I would call again. And they still said no, I'd wait till the next day, and I called again. I did that for 3 or 4 days until someone said, yes, we'll pay rent on your apartment. And that's what I did about getting the aid that was both available, as it was accessible, but it wasn't available to most people. I think what people will tell you, and you've probably heard, is it wasn't the water. The water left us. What we were left with was a recovery that was complete chaos. No one this is a storm. Usually in disasters, one part of the government works. Either it's local, it's state, or it's federal. This was a disaster where none of the government worked. So people had no idea what they were going to do or how they had to do it. And you can't imagine what that does to people. People like me, people like my husband, we read, we keep up on our payments, we know how to talk to people. And we lived for a while in Baton Rouge stayed with some friends of ours. There were 8 of us, which is not many. You've interviewed people that I suspect had 25 or 30 people in their houses. There were 8 of us, and the woman, our best friend whose apartment it was, moved out so she could accommodate more refugees. We would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd turn on the news, and we'd see what we heard. And then we'd say, okay, maybe we can get in. So we'd call somebody, do you think we can get in? Oh no, I don't know if you can get in. So the first time we got in on somebody's fake Catholic Charities press pass. So we could get past the armed guards, the National Guard and the police. And then we had to get a tetanus shot before we could get in. Well, yeah, you can get in, but you got to stop here and get a tetanus shot before we'll let you in. And when we got in, I just don't think people understand what we saw. 80% of the city was flooded. There were no services. So if you cut yourself gutting your house, calling 911 was not going to happen. It was September, it was hot. There was no portable water, so if you went to the bathroom, you went around your neighbor's house. There was no place to eat here, so you had to bring what you had. But you could cross over to Jefferson Parish and everything changed. The lights were on, all of that stuff. So we did that for weeks and weeks. We'd live in Baton Rouge, we'd drive down on Saturday or Sunday, we'd come back up to Baton Rouge. We did that till there came to be some services here. But again, we were fortunate. You know, we had people to stay. I didn't live in a motel. I stayed with friends until we got my FEMA trailer. There are 30,000 FEMA trailers in Orleans Parish. They were 250 square feet, almost all of them off-gas formaldehyde. They were put together, they cost the FEMA $150,000 to get here set up. And I kept thinking, what if they'd have just given us this money, right? Instead of putting us in these little boxes. And we were at the end of our street, so there was no one past us. So at night we were really alone and isolated, and you're living in this trailer and the walls are about that thin, you hear every noise, and I did that for about 5 months, and then I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live in this FEMA trailer. And so we rented an apartment till the house got done. So like everyone who went through this, I lived 9 places in 18 months until I got home. But there was such support and such community by our friends and our family that it felt like we were working together. What you have to understand is that the system didn't know what it was doing. It didn't know what it was doing. So it would tell you one thing, but if you just waited, they would tell you something else. But that's not just FEMA or your insurance company. It's everything. So I'll just list them for you. So you had to apply for FEMA. You had to apply for your insurance monies, home insurance, flood insurance. My husband had to apply for business interruption insurance. You had to get a permit to rebuild. You had to get Entergy to turn your lights back on. You had to get the sewer and water board to turn your water back on. You had to apply for Red Cross monies, the little Red Cross monies, which people gave up on, but I stood in line for about 6 hours because I was determined. You applied for road home monies, the $10 billion federal housing project monies, which was the worst of all to apply for. And they never told you, here's when you'll get what you've applied for. So it was arbitrary and capricious, all of it. So it would come, so like in October, they said you qualify for a trailer, but we're not going to be able to tell you when it's going to come. So what you did was you got on the phone, and I created a set of phone numbers that you called every day. And you called them 5 or 6 times a day. And I got my okay to get a trailer in October. I got mine in January 31st of 2006. And I was one of like the first 2,000 people to get trailers in Orleans Parish, only because I wouldn't give up. And the same is true about road home. So for people who didn't have that kind of ability to navigate the system, it was almost impossible for them. And they gave up. I'll tell you what worked. You could get food stamps, and the federal government, this is the only thing that worked. All you had to do was show up wherever you lived. If you were in Ohio and you're in New York, you could go to the food stamp office and say, here's my driver's license and I'm in this zip code, and they would hand you food stamps. It's the only thing that worked out of all of this. And millions of dollars came down here. So it took us a long time. We have a much better house than we had before the storm because we built it the way we wanted it. But it took our health in many ways, as I told you yesterday. I think everybody who went through this lived with a certain level of stress, of doing physical things you'd never done before, of dealing with contractors. Everybody either sued their contractor. I know one person of all the rebuilding stories I've heard who didn't either sue their contractor or get sued by their contractor because there was so much going on. So I know that's too much, but there was no pattern. There was no way that you could go and road home, you could apply for road home and you would say, in 2 months you can count on this money. In fact, they counted on not being able to tell you when you'd get your money. So you couldn't plan. So there was no way to plan. One more example, and then we can go to the bigger question, is after every disaster that's federally declared, there's mitigation money that comes down for the federal government to raise your house, either above the BFE or to the base flood elevation or something. It took 2 years for that money to show up in the road home account. So for somebody like me, I was done. I'd already built. We were back in our house. And so there are people, and you'll see them around town, who rebuilt and then they got their mitigation money and then they raised their house. So they went through that process twice because they couldn't manage to plan for this. Now, they say we could not have anticipated this kind of disaster. Well, they had an exercise called Hurricane Pam 3 or 4 months before, in the spring of 2005, or it might have been the spring of 2004, where this was the scenario, except a lot more people died. So anyway, it was I came back because where else would I live? There is no other city in this country that I would live in.
Why?
Because there's no place where the culture's as rich.
If you want to take a minute, we can take a
I'm
minute.
good.
If
I'm
you
good.
want to keep going, we can keep going. You just tell us.
You can dive down into this culture and never hit the bottom. You can do it with music, you can do it with food, you can do it with art, not so much theater, but you can do it with everything else. And where people have a sense that culture matters. I don't know if you went out last night to see the second line that came out, you know, the Indians came out last night. You can go to see people, ordinary people, live their lives with a sense of place and a sense of value about the way things look and the way that you talk to people in ways that you can't in other places.
So describe some of that, the way you talk to people. Because, you know, there's the whole, oh, they have that southern drawl.
No, it's not. You know, I grew up in a real small town in Iowa where everybody knew everybody. This is what it feels like here. You go to get coffee and your barista knows your coffee, and some days they give it to you for free because, you know, they know you're having a bad day. So here, just take this, honey. You know, the woman that checks out your groceries talks to you. You talk to her. You take a walk in the park. You speak to everybody that you pass. And it's a kind of caring. I can talk about the bad things in the city for a long time, but that sensibility that human beings have, ordinary people have something to say to each other. And, you know, if you ride the bus here, you'll be in a conversation for a long time with somebody. And they tell a story that for somebody like me who collects stories, it just goes forever. So, and you eat well, and you hear great music for very little money, and you never have to wear your winter coat. So where else would I live? Except it has, well, let's talk about the unevenness, and I can talk about its social problems, but there you are. That's why I came back. And my husband would not, he was going to rebuild. He can't, you know, we were going to come back. Our life is here. And we'll retire here.
Now, is your husband a native New Orleanian?
He's a native Louisianan. He was just going to come back, so we did. It's amazing what you tear up at when you talk about the storm. I didn't think that was a question. You thought it was a lowball question, right? That happened to me all the time when I interviewed people.
So, your other hat, the unevenness in New Orleans. There's the even playing field if you talk with everybody, but tell us about the unevenness.
This is a city, how do I want to say this? The issues of race and class and the play out in gender here are alive and well. If you're a sociologist, every social problem is here. We incarcerate more people in Louisiana than any other state in any other country, and it's by design. It's by the way we write our laws, it's by the way our DAs work, it's by the way our prisons work. That's by design that we have this many people in prison and jail here. And so that mass incarceration and the culture that comes out of that also lives here. So in part that's driven by the way that racism works. Because as Tony Oliver Smith says, the first thing that comes back after a storm is racism. So that's what came back, and I'll give you a really good example of that. The road home monies, they were created to supplement your rebuilding, what it cost to rebuild that your insurance didn't pay, or if you didn't have insurance, to make that up. And they came out, they looked at your house, and they judged how much they were going to give you either by the market value of your house or by the cost of rebuilding. So what happened was they used which one of those was less. So if you lived in an African-American working class neighborhood, your house wasn't worth as much, but your cost of rebuilding was the same. And so That's what they used. So lots and lots of African American homeowners didn't get as much money as people who live in a neighborhood like me, where my market value of my house is greater. So they sued. They sued a class action suit, and without even going to court, the federal government made Road Home and the state settle. But by then, as always, people had already rebuilt. So that's it's like redlining. It's an institutional example of how racism came back. We closed all the public schools. We closed them. If you've read Naomi Klein's Disaster Capitalism, she really talks about how disasters are used to make social change that might not have been acceptable. We closed all the public schools. We fired 6,000 public teachers, which is our black middle class. And they are still in court about this to this day. And so now we have a charter school system that's touted as a great success, which we'll see. We closed public housing units because we thought we would disperse crime and poverty by closing these 4 big public housing units. Now, before the storm, New Orleans had 10% of its population lived in public housing, and they were in bad shape. I'll give you all of that, but they did not flood in the same. They were not completely destroyed. Some of the first floor got water, but the second and third floors, we closed them. And we said, you cannot, people couldn't even get their stuff out. There are horrible pictures of people's belongings as they tore down St. Bernard's Project. And they thought it would decrease the crime rate. Well, you know what? It didn't. It only dispersed crime. So those kinds of things just happened. And we closed big charity. And it could have reopened, and we didn't do it. We just closed it because...
Explain charity, because people not from here aren't going to get that, I don't think.
Charity was we had a series, we don't hardly have any of this anymore because they're closing charity in Baton Rouge, of hospitals for people who were underinsured or had no insurance. They were the best trauma unit in the city. When somebody got shot, where you wanted to go was to big charity. And so what poor people did was they waited. They didn't have access to preventative medicine, so they would wait till their sore throat got really bad, their fever got really high, and then they'd go to charity. Well, they closed it down. They kind of opened it back up again, and they're going to open, they've got this complex of hospital units. So we made it really difficult for poor people to come back because we didn't want them to come back. And guess what? Some of them didn't. But who really didn't come back are those 6,000 teachers we fired. And other of the black middle class who got to Atlanta or got to Houston and said, boy, my kid can go to school and it's really great here. And they're not back. So we've had an uneven recovery. If you look at the French Quarter, it looks like nothing happened to it. Not much did happen to it. If you look at the sliver on the river, the uptown area that did not flood, I was staying out here, out by UNL with some friends, and we would drive, and there weren't street lights, and it was that jack-o'-lantern effect, like one house was back and 4 or 5 houses would be dark. We'd get on Wisner and we'd drive uptown and it'd be dark, 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 like you were driving in a rural country road. And then you'd get to the uptown and all the restaurants were filled, and it was just like we lived in 2 different worlds. And that's not necessarily true now, but go to the 9th Ward, go to the lower 9th Ward. You see what Brad Pitt did with private monies? He's building 150 houses. Where are the rest of the people? Go to the east. There's still neighborhoods, there's still houses that haven't even been gutted. And so the building back has been uneven because of the ways that aid came. In the lower 9th, which had one of the highest rates of home ownership in the city, about 68% of that, but the titles weren't clear because it got passed down from grandma and grandpa to maybe aunt and uncle to somebody else. But the house was owned outright, and because it was, you didn't have to have flood insurance. So a lot of those people just didn't have any way to rebuild. And they couldn't apply for road home money because they didn't have clear title to the house. And those people we lost.
What happened to their property?
Drive by, it's just there. You know, it's just there. It's.
I mean, we've heard stories. The reason I wanted to know your thoughts on that is we've heard stories that people who couldn't demonstrate clear title, their homes that property is now being developed by people who just moved in, just
I-
like developers or people who just come here.
I just don't know that. I just don't know enough to say that. But I know that there's a lot of properties here. And developers thought this was going to be a gold mine, and actually I don't think it's proved to be such a gold mine to them. I think you're seeing some places, like where I live in Mid-City, it's just, it's grown. We have, like 4 grocery stores. You go to the front 9 and the lower 9, and they're food deserts. There's not a grocery store within 1.6 miles of where people live. So all of that says that the least of us were more marginalized and more abandoned. And that began from the very moment those people, remember the shelter of last resort, the Superdome and the Convention Center we're not clear about the numbers, so I might be wrong. About 25,000 people went there dry, as I call it. Went there before the storm came. And there wasn't that much help there because nobody really thought this would happen, right? 3 days, they'll all go home. And then about another, they're not clear, 25,000 people came wet, right? Waded through 4 or 5 feet of water to get to the Superdome and Convention Center. And by all kinds of ways did they get there. Well, what you heard on national news, well, they're raping babies in there. Well, really not true. They're shooting in there. 4 people died inside of there. One person committed suicide. Somebody was in an altercation with police officers, and a couple of people died from heat exposure. So what happened inside that convention center, when you went in there after it was over, there was a circle of chairs because what they built were little families to take care of themselves. Because remember, the lights and power went out very quickly Sunday night. And you had all these people and you had no bathrooms, and what killed us from afar, you had all that news media. They could cross the Crescent City Connection, get in there with supplies. Where was the federal government? It took them 5 days to get here. And so those were the least of us in that convention center. And that continued, that these people didn't matter. You could take their belongings out of St. Bernard housing and put them on the street. They're not going to come back. It doesn't matter. So when you talk to, not me, but you talk to other people who live through that, they feel abandoned and even more marginalized. And that's a consequence of this uneven recovery. I don't know. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. So, one of the things that we also talked about are how communities have remembered or have grown past Katrina. And you talked about the artist community. And you had some pretty eloquent things to say about that. Would you mind?
I don't know if I can I'll try to get back to it. So for us, after the storm, one of the things that we talked about yesterday was that I've interviewed, 400 or 500 people about Katrina. And as a sociologist, you're always looking for the patterns. You're always looking for a way to say, oh, this is the pattern of behavior. And it's very difficult in this to find a pattern because everybody's evacuation story was different. Everybody's recovery story is different. And so you were always looking for a way to understand what happened to us. And for me, that understanding came in art, in seeing art about the storm, in hearing music that referenced the storm, and in hearing spoken word about the storm, that the way that I made sense of the storm for me was the artist. And we had a great artistic community before, and it's even deeper now. So the guy I want to talk to you about, Hollywood Delahousie, is a rap poet, artist, and his poem on Katrina has more to say than all the sociology you could write. Spencer Boren's song, The Thin Black Line, which is about the thin black line that covered all the buildings, that said more to what we used to call it ook. You'd be driving from Baton Rouge and you'd be in Jefferson Parish and everything would smell fine. But once you got to Orleans, we called it ook. It was a combination of sewer and mold and mildew, and it would just get ook. And you'd get back to Baton Rouge and your car and your clothes would all smell it. But I can't even describe it to you, but artists could do that. At Ashe Cultural Center, they wrote a play called Swimming Upstream, which was 7 women's stories of the storm. It was just powerful. It played at the Apollo in New York. It went to Atlanta. It's an amazing piece of work. Local artists were able to capture something that I couldn't put into words. And I think that's still true. And we still have, you get Irma Thomas. On this video, she sings Backwater Blues, it's a Bessie Smith song. And she sang it in New York at this fundraiser. And I used to put it in because it just touched me so much. And then I like to see her sing, and I would go to these concerts and I'd be yelling, "Sing Backwater Blues for us, Irma." And she'd look at me and she'd say, "I don't want to sing that. I don't want to bring us down." And then she'd sing it, and it would change the tenor of what she's saying because of if you read the lyrics to that song, it's all about, I lost my home, I'm on a boat. It's an amazing piece of work. And so for many of us, I think it was what the artist could say, as you said yesterday, what the scholars, those scholars who are artists say. How's that? We good?
It's very good.
What time is it? Because I could probably talk.
I'm watching the clock.
Oh, okay.
What time do you have to go?
About 1:15. What time is it?
It's 1:03.
So you
It's
got-
one
Oh, I
hour.
got time, so we could go
You
somewhere
got-
else.
Yeah. You got,
If I don't,
you're good.
I don't usually cry about. But nobody usually asks me about Katrina either. I'm usually
You're the one usually asking the
I'm usually
questions.
asking the questions.
So I usually give people the opportunity to just say whatever they want to say, in part because that's why we're kind of doing this,
yeah.
right? So I had the questions that we went over, but if you have things you want people to know, I'm hoping this will be a digital archive. People can just come and tool through, hear people's stories, take away from it whatever they wish. But if you just wanted someone who has no knowledge of this or little knowledge, what would you want them to know?
In the disaster literature, they write about disasters as opportunity. That they can be, that kind of crisis, like any kind of crisis, can be an opportunity for growth. And that's true individually, and it's true as a community. And so, as individuals, I watched people use this as an opportunity to drink more. We all drank more. We all thought we ought to be in a AA meeting going, "Hi, my name is Pam. I lived through Katrina and I drink," right? So we all thought because that was what you could do. You could drink more because you'd spend all day gutting out your smelling house, there's something to what happens when you throw all your possessions on the curb. And I remember the day I had about 3,000 volumes of books in my house. And I could save the top shelves, but mostly you couldn't save any of them. And I didn't mind the furniture. I didn't mind the clothes. Oh, I minded my husband's 500 albums. He minded that. But my friends came to me and said, "We're throwing out your books today, so you're going to go somewhere else. Because you're not going to be there when they throw out your books." So there's something about watching everything that you own on the curb and then watching people come by to go through what's on the curb to see what they can take away. It's just, I don't even know now if I can make it abstract enough to give an explanation for that. But I remember we all had dinner all the time. So we were in Baton Rouge and a bunch of us were there, and this friend of mine who'd just come back and she'd thrown her stuff on the curb. And we're having dinner, and somebody was there, and they were saying, you know, you probably could have saved that. She drove right back to New Orleans, dug in her curb, and took her stuff, you know. And so we all learned, not me, because I'd gone through this in my life in other ways, but for many people in my position, they learned for the first time that you can lose everything like that. And it taught you, many people, the value of what was important. But I want to tell the story of Bo Green, who's passed. Bo Green was a guy who lived in Holly Grove. He was a kind of, he lived on the margins. I don't think he ever paid enough Social Security to get it. He was on disability. He had cancer. He drank a bit. He was on the margins of living a life that would make you a stakeholder, right? But he's a great guy. And we met him because he did some concrete work for a friend. And when we started to interview people in Holly Grove, we went to Bo's mama's house. And he had one room fixed up where he could live, and that was the first time we interviewed him. We interviewed him 4 or 5 times before he died. And he said this about himself. He was a hero of the storm. He rescued probably 40 people in Holly Grove. He found a boat. I didn't say stole, he found a boat. And he would take people from their houses and take them to the island. There was an island on Jefferson Highway that was dry. And he rescued 40 people. And he said, I got to the end of my interview and I said, Bo, so what do you think about all this? And he said, I'm a better person now than I was before the storm. Because he found a way to give in this moment. And so he kind of took over that role. People would bring him things, and he would put food out so people could come and get food. He really changed his life, and he never stopped drinking, and he never stopped smoking, and he never got his cancer treated, and he died, like lots of the folks. So Bo Green's a hero to me. And then the other thing is, if I can do this, when you drive around town, you drive over the overpasses, because, you know, we're surrounded by water everywhere. People died on those overpasses. There's no memorial to them. People died there. So what happened was all these people would come to be dry from their houses, and they got on these bridges, and they would wait, and they would wait, and they would wait. People didn't die. Some people died of this storm from the storm surge and from drowning. But most people died here because of dehydration and the heat, and because nobody came. And so when people finally came to the overpasses, which one near my house, some people weren't able to get on the bus. They were dead. And so there's no memorial. So when you drive over one of these bridges in New Orleans, think about the person that died there, that didn't have to. Okay, now stop. I don't do this usually. Okay.
Okay. So, one more thing if you have time. You mentioned 8 months, 8 weeks, something, people cleaned out your home, the gutting of your home. Would you tell that story?
So, well, no, it was for 8 months. So,
8 months, okay.
We called this Sunday at Pam and Ed's. So for about 8 months, it would vary. Sometimes it would be only 2, the highest number of people I think and I have a little bitty house, it's about 1,000 square feet. Friends would come, faculty from other universities would send their students down, and they would gut our house, and people would bring food. And so what would happen is that even people who were gutting their own houses would come because they knew we would have food at lunch and alcohol. There was no good alcohol to be had after the storm, and so we all drank those little ponies of Jack Daniels and whatever flavor it happened to be. It was horrible. But people came, and that's what they gave to us. And they came and they gutted it, and they carried our possessions out, and then they came and, like, we had to take the floorboards, we had to take the floor out. And it was built in 1920, so there's tiny little nails, like every, 1/16 of an inch. So you would have 6 people there all day on a Sunday just pulling these nails out and doing this. And we just built community, and they came, when we moved back in, they came and moved our stuff from, what little stuff we had left, they came and moved it from storage. And so that happened all over the city, that people helped each other out in extraordinary ways. And so I'm writing this thing called Sunday at Pam and Ed's, which is, you had weird things happen. Like one day we were sitting on the porch, and I think it was the day Ed was finally letting go of his vinyl album, collection, and a guy came by and he said, we'll help you. A little couple white guys. We're from Houston. We just came by to see if we could help you. And we just didn't like the way they looked. He said, no, we're fine. We don't need your help. But now sometimes strangers helped. I mean, that's the other part to this storm. Two groups helped. Faith-based groups came down here, and they helped enormously, and the left came and helped. Lower Ninth Ward would not exist if it had not been for Common Ground and Acorn. It would be plowed under now if Common Ground and Acorn had not been there saying, these people have a right to return. So that community of, we still have that community of folk. And we are, my neighbor says it, she says, before the storm we were friends, and now we're family. Now we have each other's backs. And that's what that disaster gave us.